You're still watching The Pulse with me, Gifty and Up here. Now, way to our cross in Germany. It started in the 1930s and ended in the 1940s when millions of people, predominantly Jews, were killed during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. It continues to be the most traumatic memory for Jews and for Germany, a past they worked very hard to correct. Today, Europe, which has seen an increase in anti-Semitism offences and a rise in nationalism in recent times, is commemorating the Holocaust with a focus on Anne Frank. Anne Frank was a girl who had to write memoirs of the Holocaust. So why is she so important in the scheme of affairs, and what lessons are being drawn in dealing with what threatens to be a new era of racism? Political correspondent with our partners DW is Thomas Sparrow, and he reports schools are the target for European authorities. Let's cross over to Berlin for more on this. And it's good to have you, Thomas. Please give us a bit more of the background to the Holocaust story, first of all.
I'm pretty sure many in Ghana know Anne Frank and her story. It is one of the most famous books around. It has sold millions and millions of copies, translated to more than 60 languages, and it tells that story of the teenager, the Jewish teenager who hid for a few years in an annex and who was then found and died in a concentration camp. And that diary, which was then published after her death, has become, as I say, extremely famous. And it has also turned into something that young generations here in Germany, but in other parts of the world, can learn a lot from. And when we think about today's celebrations, today Anne Frank would have turned 90. Those celebrations are focusing on her life and work, on the lives of many, many people who lost their lives during the Nazi period, and on what young generations and everyone in this country can learn from that period so that those events do not happen again. And you mentioned correctly, Gifty, that one of the focuses this year is at schools, and we're talking here about thousands of pupils in around 250 schools that will be discussing today not only Anne Frank and her work, but also some of the lessons from the Holocaust and some of the implications today. And when we're talking about the implications today, you mentioned it already in your introduction, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitic offences here in Germany, also in other parts of Europe, which has led to a renewed public discussion on this issue and obviously to certain reactions by the government.
I was just going to ask you what exactly authorities intend to achieve with the focus on schools.
Prevention, that is the absolute key word here, because the German authorities have quickly understood, and by the way, this is not something here in Germany but in other parts of Europe, that it all begins when you talk about education, that you can focus on younger generations, that you can focus on teaching them about Germany's past, so that all those things that happened in the past are not repeated here. And in a way, this book has become more and more important with time, because what we're seeing also in Europe is that those people who directly experienced the Holocaust, those victims or the witnesses, have become fewer and fewer with time. So there are no longer those direct connections from people that can explain what they went through in the 1930s or in the 1940s. So that's when these kinds of stories like Anne Frank's diary become more and more relevant, because many young people can relate to Anne Frank's story. In a way explains the general, in other words, what life was during Nazi Germany, but it's also very particular. It's a story of a teenager growing up and what she experienced there. So in a way, it has become an ideal way of teaching younger generations, not in an abstract way about what happened 70 years ago, but in a very direct and concrete way. And that is why the focus has been in teaching in schools and in prevention.
Right, Thomas, my final question will be for you to educate us a bit on the trend of anti-Semitism, and which is highly considered a racial abuse in Europe now.
That is correct, Gifty, and when people analyze why there has been this rise in anti-Semitic offences in Germany and other parts of the continent, they tend to mention two aspects. On the one hand, the rise in popularity of far-right groups, and on the other, the arrival of certain refugees of Arab origin that have led to what some officials describe as a new form of anti-Semitism. And this has led Germany and the German government, for example, to have its first ever anti-Semitism commissioner in order to deal specifically with these issues. Germany also has now a database to document these cases. And the third aspect, and that's where we go back to Anne Frank and her diary, is the focus on prevention and starting with young people, because German authorities have quickly realized that there are also specific cases in German schools and in German universities where they would like to specifically address. So those are the three key elements that German authorities have been dealing with. That the first anti-Semitism commissioner focusing on prevention and trying to better register these cases.
Thomas, thank you very much, and hopefully never again will be a word that we actually live out in these times. Thomas Farrell is political correspondent with our partners DW, joining us all the way from Berlin in Germany. This is still The Pulse. Do stay.